All right, AP European History, folks, Unit 3, Part 2, beginning to get into some more political developments here and then branching out in the Enlightenment and moving our way through some artistic movements of the day. We're at the top of the second page of the study guide, and we're talking about the Glorious Revolution. So, in 1660, having tired of the excesses of the Cromwell family, the British Parliament went shopping for their old rulers, the Stuarts, and brought back Charles II, son of the executed Charles I. The relationship between Parliament and Charles II was strained at best. Charles was getting a lot of money from the King of France, Louis XIV, in order to pursue a pro-Catholic agenda within England. And when he died, on his deathbed, I should say, Charles II converted to Catholicism. But it's Charles's younger brother, James, who's the real problem. As the king, James attempted to create a peacetime standing army. He also appointed a great many Catholics to office-holder positions in Britain and alarmed the Parliament. In 1688, he sired a young male, a boy who would take the throne of England as a Catholic. Now, prior to that, James had two daughters, both of whom were Protestants, and so the succession looked like it was going to go in the line of Protestantism and not Catholicism. When the Parliament began to realize that they were headed down a road of Catholicism, they removed James from power in the Glorious Revolution. This is a very John Locke moment. Locke will follow us down the study guide here in a moment, but the Parliament, believing that they had the right to do so, removed James from power because he was, in essence, no longer serving their best interests. He was not the ruler that they wanted, not the form of government that they were looking for. This is a completely new idea in European society. Up until now, power had emanated from above, from God. That's the supporting buttresses of the idea of absolutism. But here, the government is going to really be founded on the principle that people derive their right to govern from their natural rights. When they bring in new rulers, William and Mary, Parliament is very careful to make sure that William and Mary agree to a Bill of Rights, a set of demands that assure that they will not be barred from meeting, that they will continue to control the purse, the they here is the Parliament, by the way, that their rights will be protected as far as the freedom of speech and the press, and that in essence this will be a joint rule. They also bury the issue of religion by assuring that the monarch would always be an Anglican from here on out. This is a pretty radical moment, right? It's 1688. You're not supposed to be getting rid of a ruler and replacing them with a constitutional monarchy. This is not the sort of thing that's happening in France or in Russia or in Prussia at that moment, and so the English are well ahead of the curve. Let's go to the realm of the mind for a moment. The Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a cultural and intellectual movement dedicated to trying to understand the universal concepts of human life. Having mastered the solar system, the human body, having studied art and philosophy and music and all of the fine other things, the intellectuals of the 18th century believed that the next best thing to study was human beings, that most curious creature of all, to try and understand what were the commonalities to all human beings throughout society. By doing so, hopefully we can figure out the best society, the best government, the best economic structure, the best policies by which to rule human beings. All of this should coordinate together to create a smooth, harmonious society that would be best for all of the human beings within that society. This is a very elite movement. This is not the sort of movement that is popular with the lower classes, as you might imagine. It's certainly something that would have caught on well with the educated and with the elites. I mentioned a second ago John Locke, or John Locke, as he sounds in my head. Locke is the real originator of the movement, and he's an Englishman. Most of the Enlightenment bigwigs are French. But Locke is the one who pioneers this idea of natural rights, that human beings have a right to remove a government that no longer serves their purposes. These are rights that are going to be invoked not just by Americans in 1776, but by Frenchmen in 1789, and by Russians in 1917, and by Vietnamese people in 1945, and continuing on to this day. These are cherished individual rights that are carried through human history. Montesquieu advocates for the idea of a separation of powers, a government that has checks and balances, because frankly we need that. Human beings are not the most careful people when it comes to assuring that we don't abuse power. Given the opportunity, Montesquieu thinks that we will indeed try to abuse power. We must be checked, we must be limited. Otherwise people are going to push and go beyond the bounds of what they are supposed to do. Voltaire advocates a system of religious tolerance, claiming that organized religions really breed superstition and ignorance and are a bad idea for societies because they're just going to lead to misunderstandings and violence. And so what's the better policy to advocate here? A society where religious tolerance carries through, right? Compare, for instance, England under Elizabeth versus England under Mary, or compare the Netherlands to Spain under Philip II. Societies that push religious tolerance seem to be more stable, more prosperous than those that don't. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the least mainline, if you like, of the Enlightenment thinkers. He's a little bit different than the rest of them. He doesn't live in Paris or in the population centers. He tends to favor living out in the countryside, and he writes that book, Emile, about raising children, where he advocates a more natural, almost child in nature position where kids are out having fun, enjoying themselves until they get to an age that's more reason-oriented. He also talks about this really elusive idea called the general will, that government should do what is best for the entire society at once. That's difficult to define and difficult to understand as to what exactly is supposed to happen, but it's supposed to be the best government for every person involved with the society. Adam Smith is a departure from the French world. Smith is a Scotsman. He's on the other side of that channel, he is. I would walk 500 miles. That's the sort of thing I think of when I think of Adam Smith. In 1776, Smith writes The Wealth of Nations, a book proposing that there's this invisible hand that participates in economic endeavors that, in essence, is every human being looking out for self-interest. Human beings do not need the government to guide them in economic endeavors, in other words. Why? Because human beings know how to advocate for their own best interest. They do not need the government in order to tell them to look out for the best bargain. That means government should stay out of the economic structure. Now that is a different theory than what we've read in the past. Mercantilism, the dominant economic theory of most governments up until this time, advocated a strong government role. Tariff, tax, subsidized, be involved. Here we're seeing a very different idea from that, and that is that individuals should be able to control activity with their own purchasing and their own not purchasing, if you like. For instance, under mercantilism, let's say my country is rather lousy at producing bread. A mercantilist government would say, well, here's what we do. We tariff other countries' good bread in order to force people to buy our really bad bread. Smith would say, why are you wasting all your energy on making bad bread? Focus it on making something good, and other people will buy that good thing, and you won't have to worry about trying to tariff things. You'll sell plenty of some other thing. What roles did women have in the salons of enlightened Europe? Women are, generally speaking, hostesses. They're there to perhaps provide the questions, but they're not allowed really into the intellectual debates of the day, and that's because this was considered to be a very man-oriented world. Women were there, but they were not there in the sense that they were contributors. What are the hallmarks of neoclassical art? Neoclassical art is a sharp return to the Renaissance style art. Very bright colors, fine lines, the use of detail, and there's a moral to neoclassical art. Generally speaking, we're trying to push some sort of an idea. Unlike the frivolous, kind of fun Rococo of the period before it, neoclassical art pushes this genuine notion of a society that's trying to educate you on civic virtues, on liberty, on justice, on service, on dignity, which remind us again of that very neoclassical, or classical I should say then, approach of the Renaissance artists. What are the enlightened reforms of Joseph II of Austria? Well, we'll finish off with poor Joseph here. Joseph is one of the rulers who attempts to take Enlightenment ideas and make them work in his country. Now, unfortunately, he's from a very backward country, Austria, where reform is going to be hard to find traction because the country is so backward. In other words, it would be one thing to say, let's reform a little bit if we're coming from a society that's a little more advanced, a little more avant-garde. England, the Netherlands, maybe the French. But Austria is sincerely backwoods in that sense. Joseph puts down thousands of decrees and laws when he is the Emperor of Austria. He ends serfdom. He tries to create equality across the bar. He tries to push religious tolerance. And at the end of his life, unfortunately, it's a mess. Remember the famous epitaph of Joseph II. Here lies Joseph II, who failed at everything he undertook. Sad. Sad, sad. Have a nice night, folks.